the annals of history, some figures are celebrated for their unparalleled achievements, while others remain overshadowed by the great men they stood beside. Roxane, the wife of Alexander the Great, is one such figure whose story has largely been forgotten or diminished in the shadows of her husband's legendary conquests. However, her life, marked by political intrigue, personal sacrifice, and the heavy burdens of power, deserves to be told. Born into the aristocracy of Bactria, Roxane was the daughter of Oxyartes, a king of the region that lies in the heart of ancient Central Asia, a crossroads of Eastern and Western civilizations. Though her early life was shaped by the tumultuous world of ancient Persia, it was the arrival of Alexander's army that would forever alter her destiny. As the mighty Macedonian king expanded his empire across Asia, Roxane's world was transformed from one of relative safety and cultural tradition to one of uncertainty and political upheaval. At the age of about 18, Roxane became a key figure in the drama of Alexander's reign. In a marriage that was both a political alliance and a personal union, she was wed to the world's most powerful man. For a brief moment, Roxane found herself at the heart of the Macedonian Empire, a queen among conquerors, as Alexander sought to unite East and West in a bold vision of empire. But this rare position of power was not to last. When Alexander died suddenly at the young age of 32, his empire fractured, and Roxane's world came crashing down around her. This is not simply the tale of a woman caught in the wake of a man's greatness. It is a story of a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, battled for the survival of her son, and ultimately faced betrayal, loss, and death. Roxane's life was not just defined by her marriage to Alexander. It was shaped by her determination to secure a future for her child, Alexander IV, and her attempts to navigate the deadly political landscape that followed her husband's death. The story of Roxane is a reflection of a woman's strength in an era where power was almost exclusively in the hands of men. She was a political pawn, a mother, a queen, and ultimately, a tragic figure in the grand drama of the ancient world. As the centuries have passed, her story has often been overshadowed by the towering figure of her husband. But Roxane's legacy, however brief and tragic, deserves to be remembered. The land of Bactria, nestled between the towering mountains of the Hindu Kush and the fertile plains of Central Asia, was a place where East met West. For centuries, it had been a crossroads of cultures, a place where Persian traditions intertwined with the influences of Greece, India, and the steppe nomads of Central Asia. It was here, in this world of ancient power and rich history, that Roxane was born, the daughter of Oxyartes, the king of Bactria. Little did anyone know that the life of this young princess would be marked by fate's cruel hand, as the tide of history, set in motion by the unstoppable ambition of a man named Alexander, would forever change her life. Roxane's early years were shaped by the customs and traditions of her people. The Bactrians, though influenced by the vast Persian Empire, had their own distinct culture, with their own rulers, gods, and ways of life. Bactria was renowned for its strategic importance, its rich agriculture, and its wealth, making it an attractive target for any empire seeking to expand. The Bactrian people lived in fortified cities surrounded by the wild, rugged terrain that provided both natural protection and an escape route for their kings and nobles. The city of Bactra, Oxyartes' capital, stood as a beacon of civilization amidst the harsh mountains and sprawling deserts. As the daughter of a king, Roxane would have been raised in the privileged, secluded world of the royal court. From an early age, she was taught the ways of diplomacy and governance. Her father, Oxyartes, though not as powerful as the kings of Persia or the emerging Macedonian Empire, was a ruler in his own right, well-versed in the art of war and the subtleties of court politics. Roxane would have been well-educated, exposed to the finest tutors in philosophy, literature, and politics, but her education was not limited to the classroom. She would have been raised with the knowledge that, as a woman in a world governed by men, Her value and power would largely lie in her ability to form alliances through marriage and the strength of the family ties she could build. Bactria itself was a land of contradictions. It was part of the Persian Empire but had its own sense of autonomy. And over the centuries, its rulers had maintained a delicate balance between Persian influence and local traditions. The region's strategic position along the Silk Road ensured that Bactria was always a point of intersection for various cultures and peoples, from the Greeks who had settled along the borders of the Persian Empire, to the nomadic tribes of the steppe. For Roxane, Bactria was both a cradle of culture and a land of constant political tension. Her father, Oxyartes, was a ruler who had managed to preserve his kingdom's independence for a time. But with the rise of Alexander, that peace would be shattered. Roxane's first real glimpse of Alexander would come when his armies, after conquering Persia with devastating precision, set their sights on Bactria. The Macedonian king, having completed his conquest of the Persian heartlands, had now turned eastward, seeking to expand his empire further into Asia. The Greek historian Arrian would later write that Alexander viewed the conquest of the East as a destiny written in the stars, a mission not just of territorial expansion but of cultural fusion. He sought to blend the best of the West with the ancient civilizations of the East, creating an empire that would bridge the vast divide between Europe and Asia. Yet, for Roxane, the arrival of Alexander and his army would not be a grand vision. It would be the onset of a new, turbulent chapter of her life. The Bactrians had been accustomed to resisting invaders. The rugged terrain made it difficult for armies to march across, and the Bactrians themselves were fiercely independent, with a history of warfare and raids. But Alexander was no ordinary conqueror. He had already proven his military genius in Greece, defeating the Persians at the Battle of Granicus, and then at the decisive Battle of Issus. By the time his army arrived at Bactria, Alexander was a seasoned general, capable of devising tactics that outmaneuvered even the most formidable of enemies. Oxyartes, unable to hold out against the relentless Macedonian advance, chose to submit to Alexander rather than face destruction. Roxane, like many royal daughters, would have been seen as both a pawn and a prize in the political game. Her marriage to Alexander, though not yet arranged, would become a key component of Alexander's strategy to cement his control over the region. It was not uncommon for kings to marry local princesses, uniting their peoples under a shared rule and ensuring loyalty to the new regime. Alexander had already married several women for political reasons, most notably the Persian princesses he had taken as wives to solidify his hold over Persia and create alliances with the former rulers of the region. But Roxane would be different. She was not just a princess of the conquered lands. She was a symbol of Alexander's conquest itself, a political trophy he would later take as a personal victory. The courtship between Alexander and Roxane was swift, and though it is unclear whether they were truly in love, the bond between them must have been intense. Roxane was a beautiful young woman, noted for her elegance and grace, and it is said that Alexander was immediately taken with her. He had seen many women during his campaigns, yet none seemed to capture his interest quite like Roxane. The marriage, however, was more than just a romantic union. It was a marriage of necessity. For Alexander, the act of marrying Roxane would solidify his control over Bactria, while for Roxane, the marriage to Alexander represented an unparalleled opportunity to secure her family's place within the new Macedonian world order. The wedding itself was a grand affair, one of many celebrations Alexander would host as he sought to unify East and West. In the Grand Hall, with guests from across the empire, Alexander and Roxane were married in a ceremony that blended Persian, Greek, and local Bactrian customs. The union of the conqueror and the princess symbolized a new chapter in both their lives, but it would also lay the foundation for a future fraught with political intrigue, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. In the years that followed, Roxane found herself not just as the wife of the world's most powerful man, but as a queen within an empire that stretched from Greece to India. The marriage to Alexander brought her immense prestige, but also great responsibility. She was no longer just a princess from a small kingdom in Central Asia. She was now the queen of an empire, the mother of an heir to the throne. And as Alexander's power grew, so did the complexity of her position. However, the peaceful days of her marriage were short-lived. Alexander, driven by an insatiable thirst for conquest, would soon embark on his most ambitious campaign yet, the conquest of India. As he crossed the Hindu Kush and marched into the heart of India, Roxane would remain behind, in the confines of a world she could not control. The empire that Alexander had built would continue to grow, but as his empire expanded, so too did the challenges and dangers that would soon come for Roxane. For though she was married to the King of Kings, the history of her life would soon take a darker turn, as betrayal and bloodshed became the only certainty. The relentless march of Alexander the Great's army through Asia was a spectacle that would forever change the face of the ancient world. After his spectacular victory at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, which shattered the power of the Persian Empire, Alexander turned his attention to the east. His ambitions knew no limits. He sought not only to conquer but to unify a vast and diverse region that stretched from the Mediterranean to the farthest reaches of the known world. Bactria, a strategically important region nestled between Persia and the Indian subcontinent, was one of the next territories on his list. And it was here, in this land of fierce warriors and ancient traditions, that Roxane's life would take a dramatic turn. Bactria, with its rugged mountains and fertile plains, had long been a land of great importance in the Persian Empire. It was a place of cultural fusion, where Persian, Greek, and Indian influences met. Bactria was known for its sophisticated cities and strong military tradition. Yet, despite its richness and power, the kingdom was now facing the inevitable advance of the Macedonian conqueror. Oxyartes, the king of Bactria and Roxane's father, had been a ruler respected in his time, but he was no match for the military genius of Alexander. The Bactrian kingdom, rich with resources but isolated from the heart of Persia, stood on the precipice of a major change. Alexander, after years of relentless campaigning, had begun to see himself not just as a king but as a force of destiny. His ambition had always been larger than the borders of Greece. He viewed his conquests as part of a grand plan to unify the known world, to bridge the cultures of East and West. His early campaigns had brought him victory after victory, but the path to Bactria would not be easy. Alexander faced a unique challenge here, not only in terms of military might but also in the cultural and political landscape of the region. When Alexander's army approached Bactria in 330 BCE, the Bactrians, led by Oxyartes, were caught between two choices: resistance or submission. The lands of Bactria, although difficult to traverse, had proven themselves resilient in the face of previous invasions. The Bactrians, known for their fierce cavalry and strategic prowess, were a formidable force in their own right. However, Oxyartes, seeing the sheer power of Alexander's forces, ultimately chose submission. The Macedonian king's reputation had already preceded him. His army had marched through Persia with unmatched speed and brutality, crushing all resistance. Oxyartes knew that Bactria, though powerful, could not stand against the might of the Macedonian Empire. It was under these circumstances that Roxane's life took its first fateful turn, as her father made his decision to submit to Alexander. Roxane, a princess in her late teens, became a political pawn in the game of empire building. Marriages between rulers were a common strategy to secure peace and forge alliances. In the case of Alexander, however, his motivations went beyond mere political alliance. His goal was to unite the East and West, to blend Greek and Persian cultures, and to solidify his dominance over the newly conquered lands. It was in this context that Roxane was brought into the fold of Alexander's world, and her marriage to the Macedonian king became a critical piece of the puzzle. The marriage between Roxane and Alexander was arranged quickly, as Alexander's own political interests in the region were pressing. The young princess was married to Alexander in a grand ceremony, one that would mark a symbolic blending of Eastern and Western traditions. Roxane's beauty, grace, and royal bloodline made her an ideal candidate to strengthen Alexander's control over the conquered territories. And her marriage to the king served as a diplomatic tool to solidify his power in Bactria. Though it is impossible to say with certainty what emotions Roxane experienced in the wake of the marriage arrangement, it is likely that she felt a mix of trepidation and curiosity. The conqueror of the world, a man who had stormed across Persia and now held sway over vast swathes of territory, was now her husband. The weight of that reality must have been daunting. For Alexander, the marriage was more than just a political move, it was a personal one as well. While many of his other marriages were driven by diplomacy, his union with Roxane seems to have had a deeper, more emotional connection. The ancient sources tell us that Alexander was captivated by her beauty, and it is possible that their relationship transcended the political realm. Whether their union was born out of love, strategic necessity, or a combination of both, the marriage was an essential part of Alexander's vision for his empire. Roxane, the daughter of the Bactrian king, was to become his queen, a symbol of his conquest and the growing empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. As Alexander's army continued to push further into Central Asia, Roxane found herself navigating a new, uncertain world. No longer was she merely the daughter of a regional ruler. She was now the queen of a rapidly expanding empire, though Alexander's military campaigns would soon take him deeper into the heart of Asia. Roxane's position as queen would require her to step into the role of both political figure and wife to the most powerful man in the world. Roxane's life in the royal court, however, would not be without its challenges. Though Alexander's conquests had been largely successful, the empire he built was a complex mosaic of cultures, each with its own traditions, customs, and political structures. In the royal court, Roxane would have to navigate the intricacies of Macedonian politics, where generals and advisors wielded significant influence. It was a world of constant maneuvering, where alliances shifted quickly and rivals lurked in the shadows, waiting for the opportunity to seize power. As Alexander ventured further east, into India and the unknown, Roxane's role in the court became even more critical. She was tasked with maintaining order, overseeing the kingdom's affairs in his absence, and ensuring the legitimacy of her position as queen. But even as she found herself at the center of a vast empire, Roxane would have been keenly aware that her position was precarious. The Macedonian Empire was unstable, its vastness a double-edged sword. Though it brought wealth and power, it also brought division and dissent. The many cultures and peoples that Alexander had conquered were far from unified, and it was only a matter of time before tensions began to surface. Roxane's role as queen was not just symbolic, it was also deeply political. As the wife of Alexander, she represented the unity of the Macedonian Empire and the regions it encompassed. Her marriage to Alexander was a key piece of his strategy to bridge the gap between East and West, and her position in the royal court would come to define much of the early years of his empire. But even as Roxane settled into her role, there was a growing sense of unease. The enormity of Alexander's empire, stretching from Greece to India, created tensions among those who sought to control it. And while Roxane was married to the emperor, she was not immune to the power struggles that would soon engulf the empire. As the Macedonian Empire expanded further, reaching the banks of the Indus River, Alexander's mind was already turning to new territories. It was in India that he would face the greatest challenges yet. Both militarily and psychologically, the further he marched, the greater the toll it took on his soldiers. And as he faced the unknown horrors of the Indian subcontinent, it became increasingly clear that Alexander's dream of an unbroken empire was in danger of fracturing. The loyalty of his men, once unwavering, was beginning to erode, and even his closest generals began to question his unrelenting ambition. Meanwhile, back in the royal court, Roxane would have been forced to contend with the growing uncertainty of her position. while Alexander pursued glory in the east. She had to manage the court in the west, a task made even more difficult by the increasing instability of the empire. In her heart, Roxane may have wondered whether she had any control over the fate of her people or if she was merely a figurehead, swept along by the tides of history. What she could not have known was that the darkest days of her life were still to come, as the death of Alexander loomed on the horizon, and with it, the shattering of everything she had known. The sun was beginning to dip behind the towering mountains of Bactria as the ceremony took place. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick with the scent of incense and the murmurs of excited courtiers. Roxane, the young princess of Bactria, stood beside her father, Oxyartes, in a royal palace that was a blend of Persian and Greek architecture, a tangible symbol of the fusion of two worlds. The Macedonian conqueror, Alexander the Great, stood across from her, his golden armor gleaming in the fading light, his piercing blue eyes fixed on his bride-to-be. It was an odd scene, a moment that defied both political norms and cultural expectations. In the grand tapestry of Alexander's conquests, the marriage of Roxane was not just a union of two people, it was the union of empires, of cultures, and of destinies. Alexander, having already conquered the Persian Empire, had set his sights on Bactria, though the region was not as grand as Persia. Its strategic location made it critical to the continued expansion of his ever-growing empire. For Alexander, the marriage to Roxane was not merely about love. It was about consolidating power. By marrying the daughter of a Bactrian king, he ensured his control over this crucial territory. But it was also a symbolic act, one that demonstrated his desire to integrate Eastern cultures into his vision of a united empire. Roxane, as the daughter of Oxyartes, stood as a symbol of this merging of worlds. Her marriage to Alexander was more than a political alliance. It was a gesture that represented his ambition to build an empire that transcended the boundaries of East and West. For Roxane, the ceremony was a moment of profound change. No longer the daughter of a regional king in the distant reaches of the Persian Empire. She was now the wife of the most powerful man in the world. At the tender age of 18, she had been thrust into the heart of a vast political machine, one whose gears were driven by the military genius and unyielding ambition of Alexander. It is difficult to say what emotions Roxane felt at the time. Was she overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion, the weight of her new title, or perhaps filled with a sense of fear about what lay ahead? Her life had changed overnight, and the path that lay before her would be fraught with challenges, both personal and political. The wedding itself was a grand affair, as befitting the union of such high-ranking individuals. The festivities lasted for days, with feasts and celebrations that included both Macedonian and Persian traditions. Alexander, eager to cement his connection to the people of the East, insisted that the marriage be celebrated in a way that honored both his own heritage and that of his bride. The Greek-style banquet halls were adorned with Persian tapestries, while Macedonian music mixed with the lilting melodies of Bactrian singers. In a world where alliances were often forged in the fires of war, this union was something different, a union that sought not only political power but also cultural integration. The people of Bactria were watching closely. They had seen Alexander's forces sweep through Persia with brutal efficiency, and they knew that his empire was now encroaching on their doorstep. Oxyartes, Roxane's father, was no fool. He understood the strategic importance of aligning with the conqueror. Yet, in marrying his daughter to Alexander, he was making a deeper statement than one of mere submission. By giving his daughter to the Macedonian king, he was symbolizing a commitment to the new order, an order that was taking shape across the known world. In this moment, Roxane was no longer just a princess of Bactria. She had become a living symbol of the fusion of two empires, Macedonia and Persia, and the promise of a new world order. Though their marriage was largely political, there was something more beneath the surface. Alexander was known for his charm, his charisma, and his ability to win the loyalty of even the most resistant people. His conquests were not simply the result of military might. They were also the result of his ability to inspire those around him. Roxane, by all accounts, was a strikingly beautiful woman, with long, dark hair and sharp features that reflected her Persian heritage. It is said that Alexander was immediately taken by her beauty and grace, and his admiration for her was genuine. While the political aspects of their union cannot be understated, there is reason to believe that Alexander found in Roxane not just a wife, but a partner, a queen who would help him shape the future of his empire. As the days passed, Roxane found herself at the center of a growing empire, a queen not only by marriage but also by virtue of her position in the royal court. Alexander, despite his absence for much of the year as he continued his military campaigns, made efforts to ensure that Roxane would be involved in the administration of his vast empire. Though the Macedonian king ruled through military force, he also relied on the loyalty and support of his generals and his family. Roxane, as his wife, was now part of that intricate web of alliances and power. Her role in the empire, though initially passive, would grow in importance as she navigated the complex politics of the Macedonian court. In the early days of their marriage, Alexander continued his relentless campaign through Central Asia, pushing deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. As he marched across the steppes and deserts, Roxane's life in the court of Bactria became increasingly important. The court was a place of power and intrigue, where the future of the empire was debated, and decisions were made that would shape the world for generations to come. Roxane, while not a military leader, was a queen, and her voice carried weight. Yet her influence was tempered by the very forces that Alexander had brought with him: his generals, his advisors, and the increasingly restless factions within his own ranks. Meanwhile, Alexander's ambitions were pushing him ever further into uncharted territory. His army, now seasoned by years of battle, crossed the Hindu Kush and began its campaign into India. As he marched deeper into the unknown, he faced the greatest challenges of his life. The Indian subcontinent, with its ancient civilizations and formidable armies, was a far cry from the battles of Persia. Alexander would soon face the legendary King Porus, whose forces stood ready to defend their land against the foreign invader. For Roxane, the challenges of her new life as queen were far from over. With Alexander away, she was left to manage the intricacies of the Macedonian court, even as the empire continued to expand at a dizzying pace. Despite the grandeur of her position, Roxane was, in many ways, isolated. Alexander's conquests kept him away for long periods, and the politics of the Macedonian court were no place for a woman. But Roxane, with her royal bloodline and the prestige of her marriage to Alexander, found herself in a unique position. While Alexander fought on distant battlefields, she was the face of his empire in the East, a queen who symbolized the unity between East and West. In the months that followed, Roxane's life became increasingly intertwined with that of her husband's empire. She was not just the wife of a king, she was the queen of an empire that spanned continents. The challenges she faced, both personal and political, were immense. But as a queen, she was also a figure of immense power. Yet, as her story unfolded, it would become clear that the marriage of Roxane and Alexander was more than just a union of two people. It was a union of empires, a union that would endure through war, politics, and tragedy. Roxane had never anticipated that her life would take such a momentous turn. At the age of 18, she had been thrust into the whirlwind of Alexander the Great's empire. A princess in a small, strategic kingdom, she was now the queen of the largest empire the world had ever known. The wedding to Alexander, while initially seen as a political necessity, had morphed into something more profound, a union that symbolized the marriage of two worlds, East and West. But with the grandeur of her new life came not only the blessings of power and influence, but also the profound isolation and burdens that came with her elevated status. As Alexander continued his campaign across the known world, Roxane remained behind in the royal courts of the expanding Macedonian Empire. It was in these early days that Roxane's role began to solidify as one of the most important, though often unseen, figures in the empire. Though she was not actively involved in the military operations, those were the domain of Alexander and his generals. Roxane held immense sway as the wife of the most powerful man on earth. She became the face of Macedonian power in Asia, a queen who carried the weight of the empire even in her husband's absence. Her new life in the royal courts of Bactria, and later in the newly founded cities across the empire, was far more politically charged than the relatively peaceful, idyllic existence she might have imagined as a young woman. At court, she had to deal with the intricacies of Alexander's imperial ambitions. She was constantly surrounded by men of power, generals, advisors, and nobles, all vying for their place in the rapidly expanding empire. To navigate these politics, Roxane relied on her intelligence and the strength she inherited from her royal bloodline. But, like all women of her time, she also understood that her position was fragile. Roxane, as queen, was a symbol of unity, but she also had to manage the delicate balance of power that defined the Macedonian Empire. Roxane's position at court, however, was not without its challenges. The political landscape of the empire was marked by intrigue, betrayal, and shifting alliances. Generals, each with their own ambitions, plotted their next moves, and the grip of the empire seemed to grow weaker with every passing year. The longer Alexander was away on his campaigns, whether in India, Persia, or the distant reaches of the empire, the more power was concentrated in the hands of his generals. This growing instability, combined with the ever-present threat of rebellion, placed Roxane in a precarious situation. The absence of Alexander, though a source of tension for her personally, did offer Roxane opportunities for leadership. She would have had to oversee the day-to-day affairs of the empire, particularly in the territories that Alexander had conquered. While her role was still largely symbolic, she held authority in her husband's absence. One of her greatest challenges was managing the multicultural and multilingual empire that Alexander had carved out. His empire was a mosaic of Greek cities, Persian lands, and Central Asian tribes, all with their own customs, laws, and ways of life. Roxane, though deeply embedded in Macedonian culture, was also part of a world where Eastern influences were pervasive. It was in the cities founded by Alexander, such as Alexandria in Egypt and the new capitals in Asia, where Roxane's influence would grow. These cities were not just military outposts but were meant to be centers of cultural exchange, where Greek, Persian, and Egyptian cultures would blend. Roxane, as queen, would have participated in these cultural initiatives, perhaps influencing the direction of artistic, political, and religious development in these newly established urban centers. While Alexander's empire was built on military conquest, his vision extended far beyond the battlefield. He saw himself as a liberator of the East, seeking to blend the best of the Greek and Persian worlds. His marriage to Roxane, in many ways, epitomized this vision. However, this ambitious dream was under constant threat, and even as Roxane grew into her role, she was aware that the empire was fragile. In the midst of the political maneuvering and the tension that came with managing an empire, Roxane's role as a mother would soon come into focus. In 323 BCE, after Alexander's return from his Indian campaign, Roxane gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. The birth of the heir to the throne was a significant event, one that solidified her position as queen and ensured that the Macedonian dynasty would continue through her bloodline. But the birth of her son also marked the beginning of a new phase in her life, one that would be defined by the precarious nature of her child's future and the unstable political environment. As her son's mother, Roxane was no longer just the wife of a conqueror. She was the protector of his legacy. With Alexander's sudden and unexpected death in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Roxane found herself thrust into a much larger and much more dangerous role. Her son, though born of royal blood, was a mere child, and with his father's passing, Roxane would have to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and power struggles. The question of who would control the vast empire of Alexander the Great was now at the forefront of political debate, and Roxane, as the mother of the rightful heir, had become a critical player in the game for supremacy. The death of Alexander was a cataclysmic event for those in his empire who had benefited from his conquest. His passing was a blow that shattered the illusion of a united empire. His generals, who had served him loyally, now turned on one another, each eager to carve out their own piece of the empire. In the absence of a strong, central authority, power quickly devolved into the hands of these generals, and the empire, which Alexander had built with blood and sweat, began to fragment. Roxane's primary concern now was the future of her son, Alexander IV. His legitimacy as the ruler of Macedon was unquestionable. He was the son of Alexander the Great, after all. But in a world dominated by ambitious men, legitimacy alone would not guarantee his survival. The generals, particularly figures like Perdiccas and Cassander, were vying for control of the empire, and Roxane, now a widow with a child, found herself caught in the middle of this power struggle. Though she held authority as queen, her role was diminished by the shifting power dynamics within the empire. Those who had once sworn allegiance to Alexander now sought to strengthen their own positions. In the wake of Alexander's death, Roxane's political influence was tested like never before. Her role, once central to the empire, became more tenuous. While the generals fought for control, Roxane had to balance the interests of her son with the dangerous reality of her own position. Her life as queen, once filled with hope and possibility, now seemed increasingly fragile. But despite the challenges she faced, Roxane proved to be a resilient and capable ruler in the early days after her husband's death. She worked to ensure that her son would retain his place as the rightful ruler of the empire. But she was not without enemies. Her position as the mother of the heir made her a threat to those who sought power. While Alexander IV was still an infant, the factions within the court saw the potential for his future reign and sought to control him through his mother. As the struggle for control of the empire grew more intense, Roxane found herself faced with betrayal, manipulation, and intrigue. She would have to use all of her political acumen and inner strength to navigate the increasingly hostile court environment. The years after Alexander's death were marked by chaos. His empire, once unified under his vision and rule, was now fragmented into competing territories. Though Roxane had secured her son's position as heir, she was increasingly marginalized in the face of powerful generals and nobles who held the true power. Cassander, one of Alexander's trusted generals, would prove to be her most dangerous adversary. As he gained control over Macedonia, Roxane's position as queen became increasingly precarious. Despite her efforts to protect her son's claim to the throne, she could not prevent the forces that sought to strip her of power. As Alexander the Great's vast empire stretched from Greece to Persia, and from the Egyptian Nile to the mountains of Central Asia, his gaze turned eastward toward the land of India. For years, Alexander had dreamed of crossing the Hindu Kush, the formidable mountain range that separated the known world from the unexplored riches of the Indian subcontinent. But while his military campaigns had already brought him victory after victory, India would prove to be his greatest challenge, a challenge that would ultimately lead to his undoing. For Roxane, the idea of her husband venturing further into the unknown was as much a source of pride as it was of anxiety. Alexander's drive for conquest had always been relentless. He was a man who could not be contained by the borders of any one kingdom or the dictates of any single destiny. After his conquest of Persia, he had continued eastward, through the deserts of Mesopotamia and the mountains of Bactria. And now, the promise of India loomed large on the horizon. Roxane, left behind in the vast courts of the empire, could only watch as her husband pushed further and further into uncharted territory. In the spring of 326 BCE, Alexander and his army crossed the Hindu Kush, entering the Indian subcontinent. His army, tired from years of constant campaigning, faced a grueling journey as they navigated treacherous mountain passes and sweltering plains. The soldiers, many of whom had been with Alexander since the early days of his campaign, were worn out, and their morale was beginning to crack. But Alexander, with his charisma and iron will, urged them forward. The promise of new lands, riches, and glory spurred him on. He had already made history now. He sought to make an empire that would stretch to the ends of the earth. For the people of India, news of Alexander's arrival was both an invitation and a threat. The subcontinent, rich in its ancient traditions and powerful kingdoms, had long been a land of formidable warriors. The first great Indian king to face Alexander was King Porus of the Punjab region. Porus, a tall and imposing figure, commanded a massive army, including war elephants, cavalry, and foot soldiers, making him a formidable opponent for the Macedonian king. The battle that would come to define Alexander's Indian campaign was the Battle of the Hydaspes. Fought in 326 BCE near the river Hydaspes, modern-day Jhelum, the battle itself was one of Alexander's most difficult victories. Porus's forces, positioned on the banks of the river, awaited the Macedonian army. Alexander's strategy, always characterized by boldness and innovation, was to cross the river at night, taking his forces by surprise and forcing a battle on terms that favored him. The Macedonian army faced a number of challenges, most notably the war elephants, which proved to be a terrifying force against the lighter cavalry of the Macedonians. Yet, despite the odds, Alexander's tactics won the day. His cavalry flanked the Indian forces, while his archers and infantry dealt with the elephants, rendering them ineffective. Although Alexander was victorious, the battle came at a high cost. The Macedonian army, already weary from years of fighting, suffered significant casualties. Moreover, the brutality of the campaign, combined with the unknown hardships of the Indian subcontinent, began to take its toll on the soldiers. Alexander, who had always inspired unwavering loyalty among his men, now faced growing dissent within his ranks. After years of campaigning without a respite, his army was exhausted, and many soldiers began to question their king's ambition. The dream of further conquest, of pushing deeper into India, began to lose its allure. The soldiers' desire for glory was overshadowed by the yearning for home. It was during this moment of uncertainty, when Alexander's future plans were beginning to unravel, that Roxane's role became more significant. As Alexander began to contemplate his next move, Roxane, back in the royal court, would have been fully aware of the challenges facing her husband and his army. While the Macedonian forces fought their way through India, Roxane, who had previously taken on some administrative duties during Alexander's absence, was becoming more involved in maintaining the stability of the empire. Roxane's life had been marked by constant adaptation. From her early days as a princess in Bactria to her sudden rise as queen of an empire, she had proven herself capable of navigating the complexities of court life and the shifting political allegiances that came with being married to one of the world's most powerful men. But with Alexander's prolonged absence, Roxane's position as queen was becoming more tenuous. Even as her husband's conquest continued, she had to deal with the political infighting and intrigues within the court. The generals, governors, and nobles who had supported Alexander's rise were now growing more restive. They began to question the stability of the empire in the wake of Alexander's protracted campaigns and the absence of a clear succession plan. As Alexander's army pushed further into India, his dreams began to fracture. The soldiers, once fiercely loyal, were now growing increasingly restless. After the victory at Hydaspes, Alexander's next planned destination was the Nirmada River and beyond. He envisioned himself crossing the Ganges, conquering the kingdoms that lay further to the east, and eventually achieving his long-cherished dream of reaching the ends of the earth, where no man had gone before. But the soldiers, who had been fighting for years without a break, had had enough. When they reached the banks of the Beas River in modern-day India, they refused to march further. Alexander's dream of further conquest had come to an abrupt halt. His soldiers, fatigued and disillusioned, demanded to return home. For Roxane, this rebellion by the army would have been deeply troubling. The fate of her husband's empire, and by extension, her own future, was tied to his success. Alexander had been unstoppable, a conqueror whose ambition seemed limitless. But now, for the first time, he was faced with the prospect of retreat. Alexander, enraged by the mutiny of his men, eventually relented, though he did so with great reluctance. His vision for a united empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the far reaches of India would never be realized. Despite this setback, Alexander's forces began their long journey back westward, retracing their steps through the harsh terrain they had once conquered. As they moved west, it became clear that the man who had once been unstoppable was not invincible. The stresses of battle, the exhaustion of years of campaigning, and the toll of the Indian climate had begun to break down Alexander's physical health. His men, too, were physically and mentally spent, their spirit broken. It was clear that Alexander's empire, though vast, was now beginning to fragment. The question of succession loomed larger with each passing day. Meanwhile, in the royal court, Roxane could only wait and hope. The fragile peace of the empire was in jeopardy. Her husband, the mighty conqueror, was facing his own mortality. The realization that Alexander's health had begun to deteriorate would not have been lost on Roxane. Her role, as the mother of his heir, had never been more important. But with Alexander's return to Babylon in 323 BCE, the unthinkable happened. After a short but intense illness, Alexander died. His cause of death, still debated by historians, was a blow to the empire, but it was an even greater blow to Roxane personally. The man who had defined her life, the man who had raised her from the daughter of a regional princess to the queen of the world, was gone. The death of Alexander the Great was as sudden and unexpected as the rise of his empire. In June of 323 BCE, as Alexander returned to the ancient city of Babylon after his campaigns in India, he fell ill with a high fever. For several days, he battled with his illness, but despite the efforts of his physicians, he grew weaker. The vibrant conqueror, the young man who had redefined the world through fire and blood, was now slipping from this world. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery, but the shockwaves of his passing would send ripples throughout the vast empire he had built. For Roxane, the news of Alexander's death must have been a devastating blow, though she had not seen him for several months as he fought on distant battlefields. His sudden death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. Alexander, at the time of his death, had no clear heir of age or experience to take the reins of power. His only son, Alexander IV, was still a mere infant, not yet old enough to claim the throne or even understand the implications of his birthright. And so, with the death of Alexander, Roxane found herself thrust into a position of great vulnerability, holding the fragile hope of the Macedonian dynasty in her arms. The passing of Alexander was not just a personal loss, it was a political catastrophe. The empire he had built was vast, spanning from Greece to India, and it was made up of many diverse peoples, cultures, and kingdoms. Alexander's military genius had kept the empire united, but his death exposed the fragility of his creation. The power vacuum that followed his death created chaos. His generals, known as the Diadochi, were already jockeying for power, each of them seeking to carve out a piece of the empire for themselves. These ambitious men, who had once fought beside Alexander, now saw the opportunity to claim leadership over the vast territories they controlled. Roxane, as the mother of Alexander IV, was now a crucial figure in the battle for control. Her role as queen and as the mother of the rightful heir to the throne gave her a significant claim to power. But in a world dominated by men, where power was won through military strength, strategic alliances, and political manipulation, her influence was limited. She was, after all, just a woman in a man's world, and her position was precarious. Immediately after Alexander's death, the empire's generals and satraps, governors, began to argue over who would take control. The decision was made that, in the absence of a capable adult ruler, a regency would be established to govern on behalf of the infant Alexander IV. But that regency would not be free from infighting, betrayal, and brutal power struggles. Perdiccas, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, was appointed as regent, with the responsibility of holding the empire together until Alexander IV could assume power. But Perdiccas, while loyal to Alexander, had ambitions of his own. His control of the regency was tenuous at best, and it didn't take long before others began to challenge his authority. The generals who had once been Alexander's allies were now rivals. Ptolemy, the ruler of Egypt, Seleucus, who held sway over the eastern provinces, and Antigonus, who commanded much of the western territories. Each took their first steps toward establishing their own independent power bases. They recognized that the empire was now divided, and the struggle for dominance would be long and bloody. But amidst this battle for control, Roxane's position was one of increasing isolation. She had to secure her son's place as the legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne, while simultaneously protecting herself from the ambitions of those who would seek to overthrow her and seize power. Roxane had always been a political player in her own right, but now her life was entirely focused on ensuring her son's future. In the wake of Alexander's death, she became a symbol of the continuity of the Macedonian dynasty, a reminder of the empire Alexander had created. But she also became a pawn in the hands of those who sought to use her as a tool in their power struggles. The men around her saw the infant Alexander IV as little more than a figurehead, someone who could be manipulated and controlled. They didn't view her as a legitimate ruler in her own right, only as the mother of a king, a mother who was powerless without the backing of a strong military leader. First, Roxane appeared to have some influence in the early days after Alexander's death. Her presence in the court, alongside her son, gave her a certain degree of legitimacy, and she was able to maintain control over the city of Babylon for a short time. But her position soon began to deteriorate. Cassander, one of Alexander's generals, saw in her a threat to his own ambitions. While he had been a loyal servant to Alexander, he now saw the opportunity to seize power for himself. Cassander's ambition knew no bounds, and he recognized that Roxane, though she was the mother of the rightful heir, was vulnerable and isolated. One of the key moments in Roxane's downfall came when Perdiccas, in an attempt to solidify his control over the empire, decided to marry Statira, one of the Persian princesses whom Alexander had taken as a wife. This was a political maneuver meant to unite the Macedonian and Persian parts of the empire. It was an affront to Roxane, as it threatened the legitimacy of her son's claim to the throne. In the wake of Perdiccas' marriage, Roxane found herself embroiled in a political battle that would soon spiral out of control. She took action against Perdiccas, allying herself with the generals who were opposed to him. Ultimately, Perdiccas' own ambitions led to his assassination. But his death did not mark the end of the power struggles, far from it. Roxane's political position, already fragile, now became precarious. She and her son were surrounded by powerful men who saw them as obstacles to their own ambitions. And while Roxane sought to protect her son's inheritance, it was clear that the empire was slipping through her fingers. The internal strife among the Diadochi intensified, and the empire that Alexander had created fractured into separate, competing kingdoms. Amidst this turmoil, Roxane's own life became entwined with the fate of her son. While Alexander IV was still too young to understand the gravity of his situation, Roxane was fully aware that the power struggles taking place around her were not just about empires, they were about survival. In the years that followed, Roxane's life would be defined by betrayal, isolation, and her desperate efforts to protect the legacy of her husband and her son. But in the end, the political currents of the day would prove too strong for even her. The death of Alexander the Great had left a power vacuum of unparalleled magnitude. The once unified empire, which stretched from Greece to India, was now a fractured collection of competing kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's former generals. Roxane, as the mother of the infant Alexander IV, had the right to claim the throne through her son, but her power was limited. Despite her royal bloodline and her position as queen, she was a woman in a patriarchal society, surrounded by ambitious men who sought to dominate the empire. For Roxane, the days following Alexander's death were filled with uncertainty and tension. Though she had no direct military power, her position as the mother of Alexander IV gave her an essential role in the battle for control of the empire. And while she had some initial influence, the political landscape was soon overtaken by ruthless power struggles that left her isolated and vulnerable. The early period following Alexander's death was dominated by the ambitions of the Diadochi, the generals who had served under Alexander. These men, once loyal comrades in arms, now saw the death of their king as an opportunity to carve out their own empires. Perdiccas, who had been appointed as the regent for Alexander IV, was the first to seize control, but his hold on power was tenuous at best. His position was challenged by other powerful figures, including Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt, Seleucus, who held the eastern territories, and Antigonus, who controlled much of Asia Minor. These men quickly began to fight not only for territory but for control over the very essence of Alexander's legacy. Roxane, as a mother and a queen, was at the center of this struggle. On the one hand, she had a claim to the throne through her son, but on the other, her gender placed her at a severe disadvantage in a world that reserved power for men. Roxane knew that her influence was fragile, and if she didn't act quickly, she risked losing everything. Yet, despite her precarious position, Roxane managed to navigate the political turbulence of the time, engaging in a delicate balancing act between rival factions. After Alexander's death, the question of who would serve as regent for the young Alexander IV was one of the first to be debated. With the empire left in the hands of an infant, there was a clear need for strong leadership to maintain stability and ensure that Alexander IV would eventually ascend to the throne. The generals, however, were quick to position themselves to secure their own futures, and Perdiccas was initially chosen to serve as regent. Perdiccas was a seasoned commander, known for his loyalty to Alexander, and he had the support of many of the generals who had served with Alexander. However, his power was immediately challenged by other high-ranking officials, including Ptolemy, who had recently seized control of Egypt, and Antigonus, who controlled much of Asia Minor. Perdiccas quickly realized that his power could not be consolidated without eliminating rivals, and this led him to take drastic measures, including the controversial decision to marry Statira, one of Alexander's Persian wives. This was a political maneuver intended to strengthen his position by aligning himself with the Persian faction of Alexander's empire. But for Roxane, this act was seen as an affront to her son's legitimacy. Statira was a daughter of the Persian king Darius, and her marriage to Perdiccas threatened to undermine the claim of Alexander IV to the throne. In response, Roxane formed alliances with some of Alexander's former generals, including Craterus, Antipater, and Seleucus, all of whom recognized the threat posed by Perdiccas's growing power. These alliances were delicate, as each of the generals had their own ambitions, but they were united by their desire to prevent Perdiccas from consolidating power. In 321 BCE, Perdiccas's attempt to secure his position ended disastrously when he was assassinated by his own officers, who had grown disillusioned with his rule. His death marked the beginning of a period of constant warfare and shifting alliances among the Diadochi. As Perdiccas's power crumbled, a new figure emerged to challenge Roxane's position: Cassander, the son of Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Cassander, unlike many of the other generals, had a personal vendetta against Roxane and her son. His father, Antipater, had served as regent in Macedonia during Alexander's campaigns, and Cassander was determined to secure his father's legacy by taking control of the Macedonian throne. However, Cassander recognized that the young Alexander IV was the legitimate heir to the empire and that eliminating him would be crucial for his own rise to power. In the years that followed, Cassander worked tirelessly to weaken Roxane's position. He engaged in political maneuvers, forging temporary alliances with other generals, while simultaneously undermining her authority. Cassander was a master of diplomacy and military strategy, and he understood that Roxane's influence depended largely on her son's claim to the throne. In a series of political moves, Cassander was able to convince the Regency Council to give him control over Macedon, leaving Roxane with little power to oppose him. As Cassander gained control over Macedonia, he began to marginalize Roxane and her son. His ambitions knew no bounds, and he recognized that as long as Alexander IV remained alive, he could not fully claim the throne. Eventually, Cassander took decisive action. In 317 BCE, he ordered the imprisonment of Roxane and her son. The young Alexander IV was declared a puppet ruler, controlled by the regent. But it was clear that Cassander's ambition was not satisfied with mere control of the child king. Roxane, once a queen and a symbol of Alexander's legacy, was now a prisoner in the very empire she had once helped to shape. Cassander's final move was to secure the death of Alexander IV and his mother. While the young king had posed little threat to Cassander's power, Roxane's presence was a constant reminder of the legitimacy of her son's claim to the throne. In 310 BCE, Roxane and Alexander IV were both executed, their deaths marking the final nail in the coffin of the Macedonian Empire as it had been under Alexander the Great. Roxane's death, like her life, was tragic and filled with betrayal. She had been a pawn in the power games of men, caught between rival generals and unable to secure a future for her son. Her ambition had always been to protect the legacy of her husband and to see her son ascend to the throne. But in the end, it was not the strength of her alliances or her influence that won out. It was the sheer ruthlessness of Cassander, whose ambition knew no bounds. In the end, Roxane and Alexander IV became casualties of the brutal and chaotic world of the Diadochi. The Macedonian Empire, once united under the banner of Alexander the Great, was now divided, with each general carving out their own kingdom from the wreckage of Alexander's vision. The world that Alexander had envisioned, a world of unity and cultural exchange, was lost forever, torn apart by the greed and ambition of those who had served him. And Roxane, the queen who had once stood at the heart of this empire, was relegated to the pages of history as a tragic figure, a woman who had fought for her son's birthright but had ultimately lost everything in the brutal world of ancient politics. Roxane's life, once marked by royal elegance and ambition, was now spiraling into darkness. The fall of the Macedonian Empire after Alexander the Great's death brought an end to the dream of unity and power that had once seemed so inevitable. The empire that Alexander had built through sheer will and military genius, stretching from Greece to India, was now a fractured collection of competing territories. His generals, the Diadochi, fought bitterly for control, leaving behind a world that would no longer be ruled by the vision of one man. For Roxane, the ultimate betrayal came not from the battlefield, but from within the walls of her own court, from the very men who had once pledged allegiance to her husband. After the chaotic power struggles following Alexander's death, Roxane found herself in an increasingly precarious position. Though her son, Alexander IV, was the rightful heir to the throne, his claim was a symbolic one that was only valuable as long as he had the support of powerful men. Roxane, once the queen of an empire, was now caught in the grip of the Diadochi, a group of ambitious men who saw her and her son as obstacles to their own desires for power. Though Roxane held the potential for influence as the mother of Alexander IV, She was a woman in a world where women had little political power, especially in the cutthroat realm of ancient Macedonian politics. Cassander, the son of Antipater, a former general under Alexander, was one of the most ambitious of the Diadochi. His rivalry with other generals, especially Perdiccas, had already led to Perdiccas' death, and now Cassander set his sights on consolidating power in Macedonia. Although initially he had been an ally of Roxane, he soon saw that her presence, along with her son, posed a threat to his own ambitions. Cassander's ultimate goal was the throne of Macedonia, and he knew that the young Alexander IV and his mother, Roxane, could not be allowed to live as reminders of the rightful lineage of the Macedonian Empire. After years of careful maneuvering and shifting alliances, Cassander gradually gained control over Macedonia. He was not only a skilled diplomat but a shrewd military strategist, and his rise to power was marked by both cunning and violence. As his influence over the Macedonian army and court grew, it became clear that he intended to become the ultimate ruler of the region. He began to isolate Roxane and her son, exploiting their vulnerability and the uncertainty surrounding the succession of Alexander the Great's empire. With the generals fighting among themselves, Cassander saw the opportunity to eliminate any threat to his claim once and for all. The situation for Roxane became increasingly dire as Cassander's control of Macedonia solidified. Cassander, fully aware of the legitimacy of Alexander IV's claim, realized that he could not fully claim the throne as long as the young king and his mother lived. Their existence, while seemingly innocuous, served as a constant reminder of Alexander's grand vision and the empire he had built. For Cassander, this was a threat that could not be allowed to endure. In 317 BCE, Cassander took a decisive step towards securing his position by ordering the arrest of both Roxane and her son. Roxane, once a queen of the most powerful empire in the world, was now imprisoned in a fortress, isolated from the world she had once ruled. The very people who had once pledged allegiance to her were now the ones who had imprisoned her, and her son's future was left hanging in the balance. While Alexander IV was still a child, his life was increasingly at risk. Cassander, despite his ambitions, was not foolish enough to leave the young heir alive, as the boy could still serve as a figurehead for rival factions. The uncertainty surrounding her son's fate was a constant source of anguish for Roxane, but the queen's resolve never wavered. She fought to protect her son, even as her own political position crumbled. Roxane's isolation was not just physical but psychological. The woman who had once been the symbol of a united empire now found herself a prisoner of a world that had moved on without her. The political intrigue and ruthless ambition that surrounded her, once so distant, now became her reality. As Cassander cemented his power in Macedonia, he turned his attention fully toward the inevitable next step, the execution of both Roxane and her son. In 310 BCE, Roxane's fate was sealed. After years of plotting, Cassander ordered the execution of Alexander IV and his mother. The execution, like much of the political maneuvering surrounding Roxane, was swift and brutal. The exact details of how Roxane and her son were killed remain murky, but it is widely believed that they were both strangled to death. Some historians believe that they were put to death by Cassander's orders in the royal palace, while others suggest that they may have been executed more discreetly to avoid further unrest. For Roxane, her final moments must have been filled with a mixture of sorrow, fear, and defiance. She had fought to protect her son's birthright and had tried to maintain the vision of Alexander's empire in a world that had become increasingly chaotic. But in the end, she was silenced by the very men she had once helped empower. The death of Roxane marked the end of the Macedonian royal family's direct line, and with it, the final chapter in the story of Alexander the Great's empire. The fall of Roxane was not just the fall of a queen, it was the fall of an ideal. The empire that Alexander had dreamed of was shattered, and his legacy, once so powerful, was fragmented and scattered across the globe. The Diadochi, the generals who had once served him loyally, now ruled their own kingdoms, each vying for power, leaving behind an empire that could never be fully unified again. Though Roxane's life ended tragically, her legacy lived on in the hearts of those who remembered her as a symbol of the Macedonian Empire's grand vision. She was the last link to Alexander's world, the last person who could have brought the fragments of his empire together. But her death, marked by political intrigue and ruthless ambition, served as a reminder of the fragility of empires built on conquest and power. In the end, Roxane's life and death were not just a personal tragedy. They were the tragic end of the dream that had driven Alexander the Great to conquer the world. Roxane's story is one of strength, resilience, and ultimate sacrifice. She had been a queen, a symbol of power, and a mother trying to protect her son's birthright in a world that had become unrecognizable. Her fall from the heights of royalty to the depths of imprisonment and death reflects the brutal reality of power struggles in the ancient world, where even the mightiest could fall, and even the most devoted could be betrayed. The death of Roxane marked the final, tragic chapter in the story of Alexander the Great's empire. In the span of a few decades, the grand dream of a unified empire, stretching from Greece to India, had shattered into pieces. Alexander's vision of a harmonious world that blended East and West was lost in the chaos of the Diadochi struggles for power. For Roxane, her legacy was entwined with both the grandeur and the ultimate downfall of that empire. Roxane, the last queen of the Macedonian line, died without ever witnessing the dream of her husband realized. Her death was the end of the legitimate line of Alexander the Great. Her son, Alexander IV, was too young to rule, too innocent to understand the vastness of the empire that had been his birthright. With her passing, the Macedonian Empire entered an era of fragmentation, with powerful generals each taking control of different territories, fighting one another for dominance. But Roxane's legacy was more than just the tragic end of an empire. In the years following her death, the memories of her and of Alexander's vision lingered. Roxane had been a symbol of the old world, the Macedonian heart of a once unstoppable empire. Her story was, in many ways, a reflection of the larger tragedy of Alexander's empire, a brilliant dream that, in the end, could not withstand the weight of internal conflict and ambition. Though Alexander's empire had crumbled, his legacy continued to echo through history. His cultural influence would endure, as the Hellenistic period that followed his conquests was marked by the spread of Greek culture, ideas, and language across the Mediterranean and the Near East. The cities he founded, like Alexandria, became hubs of learning and culture, and his influence remained alive in the philosophical, artistic, and scientific advancements of the next centuries. While Roxane's life and death were overshadowed by the monumental achievements of her husband, her role as the queen, the wife of Alexander the Great, and the mother of his son placed her at the center of the empire's tragic decline. She had been the symbol of continuity, the last connection to the idealistic dream of Alexander, even as the empire fractured around her. In a world that was moving rapidly from unity to disintegration, Roxane's determination to protect her son's legacy was ultimately in vain. But it was also an embodiment of the ideals of loyalty and the survival of a vision, however doomed. Roxane's personal sacrifice, her fight for her son's inheritance, was a story that would not be forgotten. Though her life had been cut short, she was remembered by later generations of historians and writers who saw in her the embodiment of the fragility of power. It was her position as a woman in a patriarchal society, her strength and grace in the face of betrayal, and her tragic fate that made her an enduring figure in the tapestry of history. In the centuries that followed, Roxane became a symbol of the fall of a great dynasty. Her life, though overshadowed by the men who ruled after her, still resonated with those who looked back on the legacy of Alexander the Great. Writers, poets, and philosophers would draw upon the story of Roxane as a symbol of the destruction that comes when power is not wielded with wisdom. And when the ambitions of men and women clash with the weight of history, her personal story, like the story of her husband's empire, was a tragedy of grand proportions, a tale of dreams unfulfilled, power lost, and legacy fractured. The story of Alexander IV was equally tragic. As the rightful heir to the Macedonian throne, he had been born into a world of unimaginable power, but his life was marked by betrayal and manipulation. Though he was a symbol of the hope of continuing Alexander's empire, he was never given the opportunity to rule. The murder of his mother, Roxane, and his subsequent death in 309 BCE, likely orchestrated by Cassander, who feared the young king's potential claim, marked the official end of Alexander the Great's bloodline. With the death of Alexander IV, the last vestiges of the Macedonian royal family disappeared. Cassander, having eliminated both Roxane and her son, assumed control of the Macedonian throne. But his reign was marked by conflict and the ongoing struggles between the Diadochi, the empire that Alexander had built, one that seemed invincible under his leadership, was now nothing more than a fragmented series of warring kingdoms. But the legacy of Alexander IV's death and the disappearance of his line left a mark on the historical imagination. His tragic fate highlighted the cruel realities of dynastic power struggles, where the lives of children and women were often disregarded in the pursuit of dominance. The bloodline of Alexander the Great was extinguished, but the memory of his dreams lived on in the cultures he had touched. As centuries passed, Roxane's life became a poignant footnote in the grand history of Alexander the Great's empire. Her personal tragedy, the fall of the dynasty she had hoped to preserve, was seen as a reflection of the wider collapse of an empire built on conquest and power. Historians would later reflect on the swift rise and dramatic fall of the Macedonian Empire, but they would also note the quiet strength of the woman who had borne the title of queen, who had fought for her son's birthright, and who had been swept up in the ambition of men too powerful to be stopped. Her life was one of loyalty, sacrifice, and eventual disillusionment, as the empire she had been part of crumbled. Roxane's role, though peripheral in the grander narrative, became a symbol of the cost of ambition in a world dominated by men like Alexander, and later, by Cassander and the Diadochi. Roxane's story became a reminder of how fleeting power could be. The Macedonian Empire might have been vast, but it was always fragile, a reflection of the ambitions of one man and the tragic cost of those ambitions. Roxane's legacy, like that of her son, was marked not by the grandeur of the empire she was meant to rule, but by the loss of that empire. And in that loss, her story, like the stories of so many women in history, was both a tragic and enduring one.